Welcome to the Philadelphia Latino Film Festival Q&A session with Christina Antonakos-Wallace. She's the director of this excellent documentary from here. She's also a filmmaker and cultural organizer, and her work has been exhibited in over a dozen countries, and she has received numerous awards. Christina is a lifelong activist for racial and gender justice, and her work pretty much focuses on telling stories that aim to increase the hunger and the agency to build a world where everyone belongs. Her film, From Here, it was featured in the Prayer Lights Film Festival. It's an ongoing collaboration of media makers and scholars in the US and Germany in a project called With Wings and Roots, who reframe immigration and integration debates through the storytelling and critical histories. Christina, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not very common to have such a wonderful opportunity to speak with a filmmaker, especially me, who comes from the field of Latin American studies and who I'm very much interested on the kind of work that you're doing as a scholar of Latin American studies. So Christina, how do you feel being part of this Philadelphia Latino Film Festival?
Thank you for that introduction, Raul, and really great to be in conversation with you today. Of course, I'm delighted to be in the festival. It's totally different, of course, than being able to be in person with people. So these Q&As are sort of our attempt to replicate what people would get to experience if they were in person. So I feel very excited, and I hope that the film resonated with audiences in Philadelphia. Most of the US parts of the film were mostly shot in New York, so it's pretty close to Philly, and obviously the issues that are in the film are not just New York or Philadelphia issues, they're really global issues. So it's really good to be in different communities to talk about it.
I want to start asking you first about the length of the time it took to film this documentary. You started in 2007, you end up the documentary 2019. It's more than a decade. Tell us how you started this project.
Yeah, a lot of things came together for me in terms to start the film that were both kind of a combination of what was going on for me personally in my own life with what was going on politically in the US and also what was going on globally. So on a personal level, I had, I was in my 20s, I had sort of been a young person who had grown up in the Greek American community, which is a pretty tight-knit, relatively conservative, socially conservative community because it's really organized around the church. And as I became an activist as a young person, really started to feel some tension around the kind of oppressive traditions in my own community and my own identity, and how was I going to kind of reconcile these aspects of myself, which felt so real. And that took me to spend some time living in Greece. And Greece was experiencing a major wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. This is the early 2000s. And the way I was experiencing it was that people were mistaking me for being an Albanian immigrant. And Albanians were the largest immigrant group in Greece, and because I spoke Greek, but I was making grammatical mistakes or didn't have some of the correct vocabulary for certain things, people assumed I was an immigrant. Whereas previously, when I'd been to Greece, people had believed I was Greek American. Suddenly, some people were telling me that I was lying and I should get out of their store, or they weren't going to give me directions. And it was a really shocking moment of seeing how intensely and rapidly this anti-immigrant sentiment was growing in Europe, and also really shook me out of my own romantic ideas about the motherland to see how racist my people were against immigrants. When the Greek community is a diaspora all over the world, there's as many Greek people outside of Greece as inside of Greece. So I really came back to the US sort of seeing what was going on here with a much more international lens than I had. And I was already sort of active around immigrant justice on a little more peripheral level, but I sort of threw myself into it. And at the same time, the Sensenbrenner bill had been introduced in Congress. I don't know if people remember that, but it was a really anti-immigrant piece of legislation that galvanized the kind of immigrant rights movement in the US. It was sort of not that long after 9/11. So all of these things were coming together. And I felt that the conversations about immigration were so focused on legal rights and citizenship and really missed the bigger conversation about white supremacy, about how we conceive of who gets to belong and who's entitled to rights. And it's not just about the legalities and the technicalities. There's something much deeper at play. And I really began to be fascinated by young people who were pushing the boundaries and questioning the very things we take for granted around citizenship, around borders, around the nation, around race. How could young people who are forced by their very life experience to be put in a position of being like not belonging anywhere actually offer greater vision than anyone else to society? So that's sort of how I started it. So not a very simple answer, but kind of the coming together of all these different things and then looking for visionaries. And so I ended up searching for artists and activists who I thought were really leading by example, living their life, and like their daily life and their daily lived experience was informing their kind of incredible creative and political output in a way. Yeah.
Tell me more about this search of activists, of young people that you were looking for, having kind of similar questions, discussing their own identities. How did you meet, for example, Akim, Miman, Sonny, and Tania? How did everything come together so you can start kind of planning this project with them?
Yeah. Well, it was quite a journey to find the 4 protagonists in the film. I started interviewing people really, so the research for the project began in 2005. So I started interviewing people in 2005. And between 2005 and 2007, I interviewed 50 people, all of whom had, powerful insight in different ways. But I was kind of looking for that combination of things, both somebody who had like a really strong voice, but also somebody who had things going on in their life that I thought I could actually show on screen, things that were going to unfold that we could really follow and accompany, and also people who were really different from each other and could illuminate different sort of aspects of this conversation and not just tell the stories that get told over and over again. So so it took a long time. I didn't really lock down the final person in the film, who was Tania, to 2010. I kept searching and searching and searching for the right stories. And I filmed more than those 4 people who made it into the film. It was really hard to make a decision to only include those 4, but I think each of them really brought something into the conversation that is almost never present. And I was really, felt so blessed that they were willing to share their story and allow me to follow them for so many years. So it was a combination of everything from showing up to, I went to events on the street and talked to people. I talked to friends of friends. I called community organizations. I went and spoke to people after events. I just kind of was in all kinds of different spaces to find them. And it was a little bit random. Yeah.
Some kind of leitmotif that I found in this documentary is what Miman explains as, I feel like being a stranger in my own country.
Right.
And it's something that in the case of Sonny, he also experienced as well. He goes to India to learn Punjabi and right. He feels like a tourist, and he feels that everyone looks at him as if he doesn't belong there. So tell me a little bit more about this idea of being a stranger in their own country, and at the same time, the necessity in some of these protagonists to belong to the place where they live or where they travel, like in the case of Akim.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that, it's one of the real central tensions of the film is this experience of not belonging in the country where you live, your home, and at the same time belonging there, right? That is actually your home. That is actually the place you know best. So in the case of Miman, his exclusion is a very structural one. He was born in Germany, but he does not have German citizenship. And the process of having to apply for it in many ways underlines his experience of feeling excluded and being excluded. So what does it mean to be in a country and not be able to participate in the political process because you can't vote? Even though he had legal residency, he could never run for candidacy. He could never do certain things that are only retained for people who have citizenship. So I think in many ways, these regimes, these citizenship regimes, we take them for granted in many ways as being the natural way that we should organize society. But in many ways, these are systems that have been created to exclude. And I think especially in terms of these colonial histories of Europe and the US, where different citizenships in the world give very different kinds of access and very different kinds of rights. And why is it that someone born in Germany was not given citizenship? His parents were recruited to Germany to work and build the country in steel mills, to actually help rebuild the country after the war, and yet their children were not given real rights in Germany. So it's pretty powerful and pretty obvious when it comes to literally not having legal rights. But I think, as you said, with someone like Sonny, who's turban wearing in the US, even though he has citizenship, the lack of belonging shows up in other ways, which is harassment, violence, threats on his well-being and physical safety on a regular basis. And the Sikh community continues to be under attack in the United States. It has always been, well, I shouldn't say always, for the last generation at least, this kind of anti-Muslim sentiment has been projected also onto the Sikh community in the US, but has gotten increasingly violent, right, since 9/11 happened, and it hasn't actually faded, although it's not very often in the news. So I think there's a lot of ways to be excluded that can be very threaten people's survival, not just sort of their psychological well-being, which is also at stake. And you can see that in the film, that it is actually a mental health issue as well when you are not allowed to really fully participate or be safe in your own home. It does affect your ability to be at ease and to be comfortable. But it can also affect your ability just to make a life on a practical level and to be safe. So yeah, and I think the flip side of that, and why perhaps I didn't make it a story about people who were themselves immigrants, but really the children of immigrants, is how is it when there's no place that you can romanticize about going back to? There's no like, well, back home, things would be better. There's somewhere else where people understand me. It's like, nope, it's here, it's there, it's nowhere. We have to create this for ourselves. We have to create, I mean, I think all of us can relate to having places where we are supposed to belong, but we don't feel we belong, whether it's because someone has actually excluded us, or whether we are internally grappling with something which is not aligned with us, with that institution, or whatever it is. So it's not something that's particular only to one type of person to have this experience, but it becomes very acute when your whole, livelihood and well-being is basically at stake because of that.
Something I really enjoy about the documentary is that because it's such a long project, 2007 ending in 2019, you had the opportunity to accompany the 4 protagonists through a completely life change in their paths. For example, Sonny quits the music for some time, becomes a community organizer, and then at the end, he finally reconciliates both things. With Akim, you have like this very interesting experience of living signals, landmarks in Berlin with his graffiti art, and this very powerful kind of way to say, I'm here, I'm present. But then you have him in New York completely integrating his work in a different scale, or like in the case of Tania, who's a community organizer from the very beginning, but he has like the experience of coming out as an undocumented in New York. So tell me, how was this process of accompanying the 4 of them? How did you decided when I'm going to be shooting with you, in which specific moments? It was a decision that you made, or it was like something that you discussed with them? How was this process decided?
It was definitely a learning curve. I think when I started, I imagined I would be filming for 1 year, maybe 2 years. And as I said, just to find the protagonists that I felt like really could do justice to the questions I was asking, these kind of global questions, human questions, it took me longer to find the right people. And then, of course, as all filmmakers are, independent filmmakers, we're hustling, we have other work, we're fundraising, we're trying to figure out how to do all these things on a shoestring. So everything happens also as it can happen, not necessarily on the timeline you'd like it to happen. And then things happen in their life. So with Sonny, for example, I really thought I was making this film about this like rocker boy, political rocker, and I really liked Sonny, but I wasn't really sure where the story was going to go. I wasn't that excited about going on tour with the band. I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to go on tour with this band. I don't know how much I really want to do that, but okay. And then kind of the plot thickened very quickly as we started shooting. And if you've seen the film, I guess if you've seen this Q&A, you know that, you know, his all-white bandmates really become what for me was like bullies, like sort of replicating the bullying of his childhood by basically totally marginalizing him within his own band. And the story completely changed. He had never actually been he'd been immersed in his community in the sense that, yes, he had kind of been raised and going to the Gurdwara, but as an adult, in many ways, he had gone a pretty different direction. So to become a community organizer in the Sikh community was totally a surprise to all of us. And a big surprise. So as I started filming and things like that happened, I realized like, 1 year will never do justice to this story. If we're really trying to talk about the fluidity of identity, how it's shaped and constructed by things outside of ourselves, and how also we have agency to navigate that, that's not something you can observe like over the course of a year. And then I think also as the political conditions were unfolding, for me, it was also important in some way to show how these political conditions are affecting people's lives, and how they change and don't change. You know, I think one of the unfortunate things about the Trump era is how many people seem to think that anti-immigrant politics was something new to Donald Trump, and somehow will maybe magically disappear when he's gone. In fact, these policies, many of the ones we're dealing with now, were started by, you know, Bill Clinton and you know, various Democratic administrations as much as Republican administrations. So while I think it's a huge relief that we have, you know, Biden in office now in the US, and have a lot more of a kind of optimistic outlook about the potential for positive outcomes for immigrants and refugees, this is way bigger than one administration. And to see that sort of change kind of moving to the right, but also how deeply entrenched into our entire country these things have been for so long, I think that's something you need time for. So I came to really value time. I came to really see how much you can learn from being patient with something and not just trying to go in there and get as much as you can as quickly as you can. And then, yes, there were a lot of conversations about what to shoot and what not to shoot with each of the protagonists. I had my ideas. Certainly, they welcomed most of them. They pushed back on some of them. They asked me to shoot some things that I hadn't planned to shoot. So there was really especially as we got closer over time, much like more and more collaboration around kind of trying to figure out how to represent their stories. Yeah.
I'm glad that you speak about the politics of immigration in the United States, but I'm wondering if you could let us know a little bit more about Germany, these kind of right-wing movements, the anti-immigrant sentiment that has been there for several decades. Can you tell us more about that specific environment that you had experienced, that you had lived through the film and through the protagonist?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I went to Germany, I think, kind of on a whim. The ideas had come to work on the, I wanted to work on a European city together with New York, because New York was where I was living, and felt like sort of the quintessential immigration city of the world. But I wasn't sure which European city. I didn't think Athens, although I had a lot of relationship to Athens, was really the place to bring together in conversation with New York. So I had a fellowship opportunity to go to Germany, and I thought, well, let me just check it out. Maybe it's Berlin, maybe not, who knows? I had this sort of very limited exposure to German history that was so much around World War II, and in many ways believing that Germany had reconciled with its history, had really learned from it, that they had this value of transparency in the government, and that they really, didn't have big military force out in the world, and they'd really grappled with racism. And I experienced something really different really quickly. I was an intern at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees when that was what I had the fellowship to do. And just quite honestly, the kind of microaggressions I was hearing from my colleagues towards immigrant Germans constantly, just sitting in the office, was shocking for me. It was shocking for me. And then I was there was sort of a lecture series that was connected to this fellowship and the way that public officials and other people were speaking about immigrants and people of color in Germany was so patronizing, dehumanizing, criminalizing, essentializing. I mean, I was really blown away. So when I started asking young people from immigrant communities in Germany, I'm thinking about this project, do you think it would make sense to do something like that here? People were like, please do this here. We need this kind of intervention. There was so much talking by white Germans about immigrants in the media, and so little people from immigrant communities speaking about their own experience. It has changed. I've been really lucky to kind of be there at sort of a watershed moment where I think that immigrant communities there have also been claiming power and claiming space. There are more people who are now in, public office, in the media, taking up cultural space, which is exciting, but it's totally underrepresented across the board. Germany is the biggest immigration country in Europe, and they have been recruiting workers. Then they accepted large numbers of refugees. It is also just a place that people from all over the world go to because it's one of the biggest world economies. So they've really had to grapple with their identity as a sort of country of blood descent, which is something that many European countries have been kind of founded on, this idea of people sharing quote unquote common blood, which we know there's no such thing as sort of blood descent. This is a really, antiquated, racialized, pseudoscientific idea, but many countries, many nation states are still based on those ideas. So Germany has been shedding those ideas. In 2000, they changed their citizenship law, but only for people moving forward. So anyone who was born earlier still is subject to the old laws. So as you said, the far right is growing in Germany. It has been growing all over Europe in many ways. In much the same way, I think, as the US, the precarity of this moment we're living in, where so many things are in flux culturally, has been narrated by the right as sort of the takeover by immigrants and people of color of, whether it's European culture or white culture or whatever. There's a lot of narrative that's being shared by the far right in the US and Germany, and it's always been that way. The eugenics movement kind of seeded ideas back and forth between Germany and the US. Never have these two far right movements been separate from each other. So yeah, you'll see posters up by one of the far right parties that got into parliament. New Germans, which is one of the words that Germans from different ethnic backgrounds have been using. New Germans, nope, we make our own, and it's a blonde pregnant woman. This kind of messaging that we want to be a white country, this is our right, this is our heritage. Really racialized depictions of refugees, like cartoon noses and people on carpets like flying, really, really, really intense stuff. And there's been more, they don't have the proliferation of guns like we do in the US, thank God. So we don't see the same kind of mass shootings there as we see in the US, but there have been attacks on synagogues in the last year that had never happened. There have been attacks especially attacking sort of the Turkish and Arab Muslim communities that have been the main subject of the focus of the negative attention in Germany. Racist attention is on people who are Muslim. So there's a lot of work to do there. And where I gain hope is that I think there is increasingly power being built from the ground up. So it's not all it's not all a sad story. It's also a story of communities organizing and coming together.
I was thinking also about what you said as part of your work, that you really believe on the power of storytelling, of visual storytelling. And I'm also wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about your project with Wings and Roots? Because I think it's very much connected to the movie, since it's a project that has been accompanied the documentary in several ways.
Yes, and absolutely anyone who has made it through this far of the Q&A, please join us on withwingsandroots.org. It's a platform where we have immigration histories that are intersectional for both Germany and the US. I have stories from far more than the 4 people in the film, but from all these other interviews that either I conducted or we've done through workshops. Yeah, With Wings and Roots really was actually the name of the film in the beginning, and then our work in the community sort of grew so big and had its own life that the film needed to get its own name. So With Wings and Roots, we've done all kinds of things. We've done installations, we've done panel discussions, we do workshops for teachers, for young people, we've created curricula, but all of them are kind of around this goal of reframing these debates so that we understand migration as an inherent part of our living systems. We will always have migration. We have to find ways to embrace it, decriminalize it, honor the dignity of people, and also culturally acknowledge and adapt to the complexity of living in multiracial, multicultural spaces. We always have been and we always will be. There's always been diversity, and it's actually kind of an illusion that this is something brand new. So part of what we're trying to do is just normalize this and say, instead of making this a problem, how do we actually embrace this as part of our reality and like learn to work with the complexity. It's not to glamorize it and make it seem like everything is perfect and easy, but rich art and culture and exchange and knowledge and ideas always comes from exchange of difference. It doesn't come from everyone agreeing on something and sitting around a table and being like, that's nice. It comes from when we come together. So With Wings and Roots is really about kind of embracing that lens on migration, but also about honoring the stories and all the wisdom that young people have right now, and the struggles that people are going through, whether it's because of something like struggling with their own legal status, or something of just feeling like an outsider in their family, sitting around the dinner table and feeling like it's hard to deal with the kind of tensions within one's own, family. So there's a space for all of that, and we'd love to connect with people. We do workshops for schools, for like I said, for kind of all ages. And if anyone wants to get involved, either as a participant or an audience member, you're welcome to connect with us. We're also obviously on social media and at From Here Film. And yeah, it's informed the filmmaking, this ongoing being out in the community, doing workshops, doing presentations, getting feedback, coming back, and then working on the film, I think has made it a really different film than if I had just been working alone on a film.
I think we have time for a very last question. Can you tell us a little bit if you're working on a specific project right now? What's next after the great success of your documentary? Do you continue planning to explore these topics on the next documentary, or are you more focusing on other aspects of your work? Can you tell us more? What can we expect from you in the upcoming years?
Well, I think definitely my engagement with these topics and my commitment to really fighting for dignity for immigrants and refugees and diasporic communities, and really fighting against racism and white supremacy, that's life work, that's a life commitment. Whether or not all my films and work will center around it forever, I think the project that I'm developing now is called Amazonia, and it's about Amazon's takeover of Seattle as a metaphor for Amazon taking over retail as a metaphor for kind of late stage capitalism. So it's but it's again a kind of local story. It's set in my neighborhood and with local stories here. So I think I'm interested in the like everyday survival, intelligence, and the way we have agency and systems that are crushing and still find ways to find liberation and flourish. So kind of talking about those systemic problems, but also talking about unique ways of thriving and surviving is what I'm interested in and will keep doing. And yeah, definitely interested to collaborate with folks who have similar kind of commitment to really radical social change and liberation, and at the same time making art that you pour your whole heart and soul into at the same time. So anyone who wants to connect around any of those topics, feel free to reach out. I'm interested. Yeah.
Christina, thank you very much for your excellent documentary, for being part of our Philadelphia Latino Film Festival 2021, which is coming to 10-year anniversary in this year, which is obviously a difficult year for everyone. And we would love to have been with you in person, but at least this online experience can connect us through the distance. Thank you very much for the great work that you have been doing as a filmmaker, as an activist, as a grassroots and community organizer. And I wish you the best and good luck with the next projects.
Thank you, Raul, for your thoughtful questions, and really such an honor to be with the festival.